Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod, coming to you a little tardy for our weekly show, but we're here now. So again, thanks to all of the supporters of the show and to our new network, Believe, for picking up our show to reach even more Spartan fans. If you want to join our awesome supporter community, head on over to our support page at tffinots.com/support to get the necessary links. Okay, Rod, it's summer, a million degrees outside. We complained so much about the cold, and all of a sudden it just like summer hit, and we became Florida. But it's still a lot of stuff happening with MSU hoops. We have Moneyball, which started last week, has most of the players participating. I plan to be there on Tuesday, July 15th. So if someone stop by and say hi, more than welcome to. We will do an update about how everyone looks after I have a chance to see them in person. But today we're going to talk about some general news, the injury to Kaleb Glenn, some new high school recruitment offers, the NBA draft, maybe what's going on with Mateen Cleaves Jr. All right, so let's start with the discussion of the injury to Kaleb Glenn, who sustained a patellar rupture, tendon rupture, and that's going to sideline him for, uh, you know, the rest of this season at least. And then there's going to be a fairly decent recovery period that's going to be required too as well. So I guess there's a lot of consternation in the Spartan world, we'll say, about losing him. I mean, obviously, you don't want to lose depth, and he's one of the people they brought in to help with the shooting from that was not so great last year. He came in, as fans may recall, from FAU. He had 2 years of eligibility, so I think he finished his sophomore year, and by all indications, was looking pretty good. And then sort of just non-contact, sort of those things that just happens. It's a patellar tendon, of course, is for your knee, so you obviously can't have that, doesn't heal itself, and that's definitely had needs surgical repair. So he's out for an extended period of time. And, it's hard to know what impact it's going to have on the roster because we didn't really know what it was going to look like anyway when it comes to anyone who's currently on the team prior to the transfers or the new players. And so I guess just kind of talk just generally about Kaleb Glenn, what his loss means. Obviously, it's not good, but, the impact, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a median position you can take here, I think, between um an extreme of, oh, it doesn't matter, and oh my God, it's catastrophic. It's neither of those things. You're right, and it's important to keep in mind that you can't know what he would have been, in the counterfactual where he plays, because
Right.
you can talk about, well, he was second team all, American conference last year at FAU, and he was he's a top 100 recruit when he went to Louisville initially coming out of high school. So that's uh that's all true. And I would have assumed that he would be a very solid contributor for Michigan State this year. But I don't think he was going to start. Would he have been the sixth man? Maybe. Yeah, maybe.
Hmm.
Because of the versatility he had to be able to play. We talked to John Borovich, actually credit John Borovich for not letting on at all what was going on. We had him because we asked him about Kaleb Glenn, and he was talking about how we probably the tell was when he emphasized, what's one of the things that's great about Kaleb is that he's got 2 years of eligibility.
Right.
That should have been a tell, maybe, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but he talked about that versatility, that ability to play the three and the four. And I think that's how they would have used him, as a backup at both positions, because despite the fact that he was a good shooter at FAU and is a good player, I don't think there was ever a world where he was going to start opposite Cohen Carr.
Right.
Nor were there likely to be, short of extreme foul trouble, many situations where that would be a lineup. And the reason is, you want to have a secondary ball handler out there at all times. We got spoiled the last few years where you would often have three guys out there who were all
Right. Yeah.
good primary ball handlers. Well, that's not going to be the case very often, if ever, this season. But you need two. And I'm not saying that neither he nor Cohen Carr can handle the ball, but it's not their strengths. Whereas guys like Trey Fort, Kurtang, it is, and they're going to be able to handle that. So I don't think Kaleb was on track to likely be a starter, but he would have played a big role. There's no two ways about that. As you mentioned, part of the reason he was brought in was to add shooting. I think another reason was his size at six
Hmm.
seven and fairly well put together. He was at the very least likely to slot into the role that Frankie Fiddler played last year, but I think it was probable that Kaleb would have played more minutes than Frankie did. This team isn't quite as deep, and maybe he would make the transition better to Big Ten play than Frankie did. It took Frankie, I would say, half a season before he
Yeah.
really had his
Hmm.
sea legs underneath him. I would have anticipated that Kaleb Glenn would have gotten there a little quicker. But so all that is to say that he was, yeah, you were expecting him to be a significant part of what Michigan State is doing. But as I mentioned, this is not catastrophe. And I believe that for a couple of reasons. The first one is I think some people are looking at this through the lens of last year's team, say, wow, depth is a huge part. Yeah, depth is always significant at Michigan State. It's significant most places. So that's nothing new.
Hmm.
But this was never likely to be a team, in my opinion at least, that repeated what last year's team did. Tom Izzo's always emphasized depth in this program, but I don't think we've ever seen a team that set up quite the way last year's did, where you truly had such an equitable distribution of minutes across
Right.
10 guys. This team was never tracking for that. I'm going to be surprised, and I would have said this before the injury, if Cohen Carr and Jeremy Fears at a minimum are not knocking on the door 30 minutes a night. That's my expectation. I think that's how important they are to what they plan to do. And I think that's probably what they're capable of stepping into in terms of roles. So we're not talking about a situation where the minutes are going to be distributed quite as equally. So I don't know what Kaleb Glenn would have averaged. We'll never know in terms of minutes. And
Yeah.
we'll never know how effective he would have been. And all that's a counterfactual that, some people might find interesting, but not me. We're where we are. The second reason, though, I don't think it's catastrophe is if you never want anybody to get hurt. But honestly, if I had to pick a spot where you got to lose somebody, pick your spot. That's the one. And the reason I say it is, well, first of all, again, you've got a starter there. You're not talking about
Right.
losing a starter. You
Hmm.
got Cohen Carr. But beyond that, you actually have two legitimate options. We'll see how legitimate as time goes on in Cam Ward and Jordan Scott, both of whom have size, both of whom can play that position. That's a big deal. I'm talking about the big wing. And in Cam's
Right.
case, he's also likely to be the backup at the four. Um, if you were talking about Kurtang going down, for example, or Trey Fort, either one of them, well, that's one of your two secondary ball handling guards that are gone. And yeah, maybe Jordan Scott could have slipped into that position as well, but that's a tougher fit. If you lost one of the 2 point guards, you don't have any other candidates there. If you lost one of the big men, Jesse McCullough's in a boot, he's apparently not going to be back to practice for another 2-3 weeks in some point in July. So I'm not worried about that. But honestly, if that were a long-term thing, that's a problem
Yeah.
because he's the only big man you got behind Jackson Kohler and more importantly, maybe Carson Cooper.
Right.
So you see what I'm saying? This was honestly the only spot where you look at and say, okay, this is not great, but they actually have guys who at least physically and in terms of their skill sets are able to slip into that role. The fact that you're talking about two freshmen always creates a question as to how well they're going to adjust to the level of play quickly.
Hmm.
But this is the other thing I would say too on that front. If it's got to happen, better that it happen in mid-June
Yeah. Right.
because they've got the whole off season. They know what the deal is. And so that, you're always trying to develop everybody as quickly as you can. But I do think there's nothing like a sense of urgency where it's actual rather than theoretical
Yeah.
to
Right.
spark that. I fully expect Cam Ward to be an immediate impact guy. I thought that before any of this happened. So I'm not worried. We'll see exactly what that amounts to, but I'm not worried about him not, the level's too much for him as a first year guy. The other thing to say about Jordan Scott, I go back to that interview we did with Borovich. He mentioned that when Jordan got on campus, he was at 195, and he
Hmm.
figured it wouldn't take much to put another 10 pounds on him by the end of the summer.
Right.
If he's at 205, that's the biggest concern. With Jordan Scott, it's never been about, oh, can he develop a shot, or can he handle the ball, or can he be bigger than 6'7". Those things are already there. It was
Yeah.
frame, it was strength. And we talked about how during the course of his last season in high school, it looked like he had started to fill out a little bit. And that appears to be continuing. That's good news. Because if he can actually prove capable physically, well, then MSU's still 10 deep,
Yep.
you know? And I think right now, I mean, I'm optimistic in this stuff by nature, but if I had to bet on it being more likely or less likely that he's able to at least contribute at some level where you feel comfortable playing him regularly on a game in, game out basis, even if it's only 8-10 minutes, I would bet on more likely. That's
Yeah.
just my inclination. So that's what I'm saying. It's not to dismiss this. You'd rather, all else being equal, you'd rather have a guy who's done it available to you,
Yeah.
right?
For sure.
But if it had to happen, I would be much more concerned, honestly, even though people's expectations are not the same. If it was Divine Uwachukwu who had this happen, I would be much more concerned, because Denim Wojcik would be the answer there, I guess. But there's not an answer that appears as likely to work out okay for
Right.
the
The
role.
positional depth is just different than
Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
absolutely. And the same thing for if Jesse McCullough were out for a long
Hmm.
time. Well, there isn't anybody else 6'10",
Right. Yeah.
So it's yeah, you see my rationale on this.
For sure. Yeah. And I guess, the important thing too is just we had they hadn't played in it's not the season mid-season. It's not like he'd
Right.
been playing a bunch. And so there's not any sort of adjustment that has to happen during with the minutes
Well,
allocation, the rotational,
that
the familiarity playing with each other on the floor, and suddenly people are
absolutely.
playing with people who are not used to be there. Now that's not really an issue. So yeah, it's not disaster. Certainly not something you want, but also I think it's important to remember too that the depth, or I guess the amount of players you have who you would suspect can play, is much more now than it was a couple years ago, just because of the extra scholarships too. And so, anyway, I think that's just its impact is not as significant as people make it seem. And as you said, we don't know. Maybe he was going to be, in the NBA draft, and now he's not. So we
You
have no way
don't
of
you
knowing that,
don't
of
know
course.
that, or you don't know if he would have come in and shot 21%
Exactly. And then people
from
would have
three,
been,
because it
yeah,
and that's not a knock on him. It's just to state the reality that it
yeah,
happens. And in this environment, the current state of play, uh, you can't know. Every team is active in the portal. Every team has significant roster turnover, and the evidence is clear. There is no rhyme or reason to it.
right,
Some places it works out, some places it doesn't, and the next year that can reverse. And
yeah,
so that's not a knock on him. It's just to state that if you're viewing this through the lens of they lost known quantities, no, there was no way to know for sure how that was going to transition. The definitive thing you can say is you lost a possibility, you lost another option
right,
for that
yeah,
to happen, which is not nothing. That's significant, but it's not. I made the statement when this got announced. Like, the more I thought about it and looked at it, this does not change and I still haven't settled completely on what my overall view is of MSU, but I can say with pretty strong conviction this isn't likely to change that overall perception of this team's floor and ceiling. It
right.
really doesn't, for the
Yeah, no,
reasons
I
I
feel the same.
articulated.
I feel the same thing, the same way. In fact, I don't even know. Yeah, I don't know where you're going to end up, but I still feel like this is the team that is the team to beat. I know Purdue is the projected number one team, probably come by the media coming into the season, but I tend to think until Michigan State proves that they're not, I think I'm going to go with Michigan State with Jeremy
Well,
Fears as
I would,
the sophomore or redshirt
yeah,
sophomore.
yeah, and I would say this. I know enough about how I'm likely to come in to say that I expect them to be a contender. I expect them to be a
For sure.
team that is at the upper tier of the league. Where all that, what I was really getting at is where that comes out. I'm not going to pick them to win it. I know that. I'm going to pick Purdue. But beyond that, after that, to me, there is a pretty clear cut. You've got Purdue that's because of the pieces they brought back, and yeah, they've added some guys too, but it's really about the guys they've got coming back, which is the same reason I think to feel good about Michigan State because
Yeah.
you've
Hmm.
got you've got four guys, three of whom are starters back, and then another Cohen Carr might be the best of them all, and he
Right.
wasn't a starter regularly. I think he might have started a game or two, but that's a reason to be bullish on Michigan State. It's in this era we were just talking about of constant turnover, whatever continuity you've got, hold on tight to that because that's a precious commodity in the modern game. So, and Michigan State has a lot of that too.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we move on, just a quick reminder that if you need clean windows or your house washing in the Grand Rapids area, which is a very large area, make sure you contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They do fantastic work. They've taken care of my family's house. They can not only work on houses, they can obviously work on apartment buildings, high rises, whatever it might be. They even clean the windows of the state capitol, so they can do it all. Uh, they took care of Kurt from the Brothers Just Gutters as well, and he went on and on about how great they were. They're there for hours, very meticulous, the nicest guys, and that was exactly my experience too. Super thorough. So contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. You won't regret it. The nice part is too, as
So,
a listener of the show, 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate.
so are you saying that we now have cross pollination going on between our sponsors?
We do. Our sponsors are using each other now, even so. It's
That's fantastic.
I mean, you get good advice and you go and you take it. And so, we don't recommend anybody here who's not any good. And I think,
Yeah.
all three of our main sponsors, we have utilized their services. I know you haven't had a chance since you don't live in Grand Rapids, you're not able to use the Squeegee Squad.
I've used the other two.
Yeah. And they do fantastic work. So highly recommend. And I'm just looking out my window right now. That is very dirty. I'm not in Grand Rapids, so I can't use the Squeegee Squad. I'm like, this is the window I'm gonna have to clean myself. So all right. So moving on, let's talk about some happy news. I guess as far we'll say with new recruitment offers from Michigan State for 2026. Some of these players we talked about, most of them we have not actually. So it'll be interesting to sort of get your thoughts on things. And we'll begin with Carlos Medlock Jr. He's a point guard. He just got an offer, and these all happened within the last few weeks, I suppose you'd say. And so he's a point guard. He wasn't even on our list, and I think one of the concerns people
He
had,
should have
right?
been. He should have been.
He was being
That
recruited
was
for
my
sure.
fault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a million names you got to put down. So, but anyway, the interesting thing about him is he's kind of small, and so that's the thing that people have been concerned about. But so why don't you talk about Carlos?
Yeah. So he's a listed, I think they list him as 6'1", but realistically, you talked about someone who physically, I think, is very comparable to Tyson Walker. That gives you a good model for what he is physically, a very small guard, and a point guard. He has been formerly of Wayne Memorial. He led them to the state championship game where they got beat by KJ Torbert's East Lansing and Kingston
Hmm.
Thomas and Cam Hudson and a bunch of guys with MSU connections. The East Lansing High School beat them in the Division One. I'll always call it Class A state title game.
Yeah.
And he had a really good season. So this spring he's played for Phenom United, which is an Adidas team out of Ohio, and a young program. They've only been around, I think, maybe 3 years, but a very good program. And he's been outstanding. He's among so the Adidas circuit. not quite EYBL, but definitely a solid second best in terms of the summer shoe circuits. He's top five in that circuit in scoring thus far. So he's really been and has played exceptionally well in terms of running the team by all accounts. So he's having a breakout year and breakout spring, summer, I should say. And what that's resulted in is all of a sudden, whereas before he had mid-major offers, which is kind of the reason I had not that he got past me, and I was aware he had taken unofficials to MSU in the past, so he had been around, but he
Hmm.
hadn't gotten high major offers yet, and the reason for that I think was fairly obvious. It was size related. That's usually the reason why guys who end up being very good players who start out at mid-major level, it's usually the reason why they don't get a high
Right.
major offer. It's one of two things. It's either size, which is the most common denominator there, or sometimes it could be maybe a guy who's got size, but the belief is they don't have the athleticism
Hmm.
that's usually you expect at that level. And so they end up having to go down to the mid-major level. And, in the modern game, of course, that you go down, you play a year and prove yourself, and then you transfer. And that's kind of what I thought was going to be Carlos Medlock's path. I knew he was a very good player, but I thought, well, he's going to have to go down to the mid-major level, kind of light it up
Right.
there, and then he'll get a chance. Well, we're past that because of the way he's played this spring. MSU was the first, the high majors to offer. It was followed a couple of days later, I believe, by Michigan, and then the University of Washington has gotten in. So three Big Ten offers. I haven't noticed in the last few days if he's gotten any more, but it will not surprise me. At this
Yeah.
point, I would expect he will get more.
Once you
So
get those three, yeah, you're gonna get other people
you
are gonna
would
jump
think,
on.
you would
Yeah.
think. Now, the interesting, and it looks like he was just on campus probably for an official, I would assume. It hasn't been talked about, but there was a photo that came out yesterday of him in the jersey with Izzo in the Berkowitz. So that's usually a sign that you're on your official. I know he visited Michigan, and that's where he got his offer when he was actually on campus. Now, the interesting thing about Michigan is that I believe this is the case. Carlos's dad, Carlos Medlock Sr., was a very good player in the early part of this century, and he played at Eastern Michigan. And I believe he was there when Dusty May was there on staff as a GA, I think.
Oh,
Or
okay.
maybe
Hmm.
maybe he was an actual assistant. I don't recall. But when he was on staff there in some capacity. Now I have seen it suggested that he's not a priority for Michigan. So I don't know. Those are Michigan sources that have been saying that. And that could be the case because you you frequently see it. And we've seen it even with Tom Izzo at times where you if there's an in-state kid that is perceived to be at the high major level, you want to be careful about not offering them. It doesn't necessarily mean you want them even, but there's a political game to that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We'll find out. It does appear that Michigan State, however, is very serious about him. This is how I look at it. If he were to commit to Michigan State, I'd be happy with that because I do think he can play.
Hmm.
And I think over time, I mentioned this on the Spartan Mag board after it happened. I would slot him. He's not at the upper tier of point guards that they've recruited over time. This is not a Cassius Winston, Kalen Lucas, Mateen Cleaves. He's not that, in my opinion. But he's better than other guys they've recruited, even ones they haven't landed. So he's a solid. There would be no issue with him being a part of Michigan. I don't think he's a reach. I think he could, the questions would be about size, but I think he would probably overcome that.
Hmm.
To
Yeah.
me, the bigger issue is this. MSU currently has two guys at the
Right.
point guard position who are sophomores. So they're going to have 2 more years of eligibility when Medlock would get here. is he comfortable with that? And then the other answer would be, okay, maybe you're log jammed a bit at the point, but he is a good shooter and a good scorer. So I made that Tyson Walker comparison. I could see where he could emerge as a guy who could actually be pretty productive off the ball. It's easier to see him doing that than, say, at this point at least, Fears or Ugachukwu,
Sure.
you know. But does he want to do that? Because obviously his future in basketball beyond college, whatever that might be, for a guy who's sub 6 feet, in reality, it's going to have to be at the point,
For
you
sure.
know?
Yeah.
So these are the questions that come in. There's also the fact that if he were to go to a high major that wasn't Michigan State, if I'm just throwing this out, if he went to like a Penn State, a Minnesota, somebody like that, might the opportunity for a big early role at the point be more viable? Yeah,
Hmm.
probably so. So
Right.
these are the issues that I think surround this. It's going to be interesting to watch, but if they can get them, great, because that gives you again more depth, more versatility at one position where you got to have options. You have to have
Right.
real options. You can't fake a point guard. We've seen how that goes on the rare occasions MSU's been stuck without one. It's not good.
Yeah.
Um, so it would be great to add him from that perspective, and I do think he's going to be a good player. It's just a question of fit and role, and what does he want, and does that match with what MSU has available, and all of that, right? So
Yeah. Well, it's complicated in some respects too, because when you have not only does Michigan State have a lot of point guards, I shouldn't say a lot, but two. But if you suddenly have a third, they're all kind of in the same age bracket. We'll say. I mean, as far as eligibility,
that's
as
the
far
thing.
as
Yeah,
like we look at things. We have Jeremy Fears, who's basically he's a redshirt sophomore, so he has 3 years left. You have Divine Ugachukwu, who has 3 years left because he was a true
yep,
freshman last year. So you have two guys who are basically going to be there for the next 3 years. Now, I say that, of course, we all know the reality is uh, I have a hard time imagining Fears not being here throughout as long as he wants to be uh, for his college career. But I could imagine Divine not being here. And so that's another consideration if you're going to come in as, if you're Carlos Medlock, you're like, well, I can come in. Yeah, I'm going to be the third person, but the likelihood is I might be second. Like if Divine looks really, really great and he's, you know, expressed himself and looks like he's really starter material, it's going to be probably hard to keep him on as a backup
right.
point guard unless you can say play him off the ball a little bit or have two point guards out there, which you could do. He's got some size too. But anyway, it's
All
certainly
these
all
considerations
these
are
things,
in
yeah.
play.
And there's no
Yes,
way and for on the flip side for Michigan State standpoint, you almost can't get too much depth there because of these considerations, because it's entirely likely or possible that someone leaves, departs, and so it'd be nice to have someone who's familiar with the system, who's in the wings, who's willing to stick out for a year or two. But to your point, it just kind of depends. It's going to depend on what Medlock, what Junior really wants to do.
I think that from the MSU perspective, and this is true for every school now, you kind of have to approach this as, well, look, we just need to get the best players that we can,
Right.
and it will sort itself out. That is not how Tom Izzo likes to operate. It's not his preference, but I think this offer, because this is the first one we when we did the recruiting episode a couple weeks back, we talked about some guys. Then there are a few who have at least the potential to play some point guard, but they were all bigger, which
Yeah.
was very easy to understand. So, all right, that's a guy you can see could at least play off the ball early. Medlock is
Hmm.
the first guy who really doesn't fit that mold where you look at him and say, yeah, primarily at some point in this guy's career, he's going to have to be a point guard.
Yeah.
And so that's a little different. But I think that the way I read it is fundamentally an in-state kid who's playing this well is too good to pass on. And you gotta do it. You gotta offer. And if he wants to come, then it sorts out however it sorts out.
Yeah, and you think overall too, the kid from in-state is a little bit lower of a flight risk than someone who's coming from,
That too. That too.
Nevada or something like
And
that.
it
So,
and it's also, last thing on him, it's also worth mentioning that he is, I mentioned he's before at the outset of this, that he was formerly of Wayne Memorial. He's going to play his senior year at Link Academy in Missouri. And interestingly, he's going to be paired there with another guy who just got an MSU offer, but this was somebody we did discuss the other day in Tristan Reed, who's a big
Right.
man.
Yeah, we'll talk about him in just a moment. Before we do, just a reminder, we talked about Troy, and I don't know Troy from the Squeeze Squad of Grand Rapids has had Kurt and the Brothers Suggest You Gutters do his gutters. Maybe I don't. I'm not sure. I'll have to ask Troy. But either way, the Brothers Suggest You Gutters they've worked on Rod's house. They've worked on mine. They've done my helped fix the gutter situation in my wife's office. They do fantastic work. They are very professional, great pricing. They can do whatever you need, whether it's just repaired, replace, cleaned out your gutters, put leaf guards on so you don't have all this stuff accumulating in your gutters and clogging them up so you have to get in your ladder and clean them out all the time. Whatever you need done, they just do gutters. They're not going to try and sell you anything else, and they do fantastic work. Get the job done very quickly. In also, as a listener to the show, you get 10% off if you just mention Final Four when you get your estimate, and you can do that at our support page at the finalfoursontheschedule.com/support. So check them out. You will be glad you did. This is definitely time when you realize with all the thunderstorms we've had, whether your gutters work or they don't. So, moving on to another offer is Quinn Costello. He's a power forward.
Yeah, and this is a classic kind of late riser, spring, early summer phenomenon kind of case. So he's a 6'10", very skilled power forward. He's very thin too. So not a bruiser, at least not yet, but very, very skilled. He got an invite to one of the top 100 camps and apparently lit it up. And as a result, got a slew of high major offers, one of which was Michigan State. And this happens every year. Somebody emerges or a few guys emerge in these events and they go from no high major offers to 20 in the blink of an eye. I'm not sure exactly where his is at, but it's double. I believe it's double digits. The interesting thing to me is, you'll see this sometimes, and Michigan State doesn't do this as much as many other programs, their peer programs do, but you will see situations where somebody blows up, Michigan State offers, and then you never really hear anything again.
Mm-hmm.
They throw their hat in the ring. It becomes very apparent, very clear that they're not serious and they're out. They don't tend to waste their time. That's might not be the case here because I did notice, I don't know, it was earlier this week, there was an event. We're getting back into games again. The shoe circuit events haven't started back up, but we are getting back into some AAU play. There's some non-shoe event tourneys that are going on. And Tom Izzo was courtside watching them. So, I know what it was. He plays in, I can't remember which prep school, but he plays in the New England Prep School League
Okay.
during the winter. And they had and you see that this time of the year, the old Izzo shootout was an example of lots of these where high school teams are playing. And his prep school team was playing and Izzo was courtside. So that suggests to me that this is at least one to keep an eye on. We'll see. There hasn't been a lot of noise yet. He certainly isn't in a spot where he's cutting lists or any of that stuff. But again, very skilled shooter, no relation to Matt Costello, to clear that up for
That was my
anybody who's
question.
wondering. No, he's not a Michigan kid. He's an East Coast kid. But yeah, just the fact that I saw that Izzo was out there seeing him again, that's usually a sign. Okay, there's at least been some reciprocity in this for Izzo to bother going out to see him. So we'll see how it develops, but definitely a name to keep an eye on.
All right, and then we'll just briefly mention that we had talked about Tristan Reed before. I don't think when we talked about him that Michigan State had made an offer yet. He's a power forward, obviously related to Terrace Reed, formerly of Michigan and then of UConn.
Yeah, and as we discussed the last time, some similar strengths to his brother in that he's very big, he's well put together, but he's got good mobility, the potential, I think, to be a really good defensive player in the way that Michigan State wants its big men to defend, meaning, you got to be mobile, you got to be able to defend away from the basket, be able to handle switches and guard guards, at least for you know, short increments of time to hang in there for
Yeah.
10 seconds, 5 seconds. He seems to have all those physical tools, and he apparently plays with some intensity. Like there's a high motor here. So all of those are good things. We know that unless the NCAA does decide to change its eligibility rules and grant an extra year, Michigan State's going to lose two big men. So
Right.
one way or another, they're going to fill those slots. And frankly, there aren't many candidates. And in terms of the guys they've actually offered, where it's been public in the high school ranks. So Tristan Reed getting an offer is an interesting one, and again, one to pay attention to. Again, to reiterate what we talked about the last time, one interesting component of that recruitment is that Saudi Washington is the primary there, and Saudi Washington was the primary for his brother, and the guy who, when he
Mm-hmm.
went to Michigan, he was the primary recruiter there. I tend to think that in most instances, I'm not going to say all because there are exceptions to this, but in most instances, the impact of assistance on recruitments, and certainly at Michigan State, can be overinflated by fans. So, Michigan State for sure, Tom Izzo's the closer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's
Right.
what, there are other programs, in the past where it might be a bag man as a recruiter, or just
Yeah.
a guy has a certain, guy like Tommy Lloyd when he was at Gonzaga, he had his network of foreign resources that help them land a lot of non-U.S. kids. There are some instances like that, but this is one where I think it could be helpful because there's obviously a relationship with the family and a history there, so that's a good thing. But we'll have to see where it goes. But I would expect, from what I know, I would expect Michigan State to be they were a serious player in his brother's recruitment. They didn't get it done, obviously, but they were in there for the long haul. So I would expect that will be the case here.
Yeah.
And
Well,
again,
as a quick,
he's going to play with Carlos Medlock this winter.
yeah, so it'd be
So
interesting to see them together.
yeah,
How that relationship works. Certainly with point guard and you've got a power forward, you definitely see what the sort of chemistry is there too.
he
Whether that
he's he
could be.
actually could be more of a center. I think he can play both. I mean, he's only
Hmm.
6'8", 6'9", but he's got. I think I wouldn't just lock him into power forward.
Well, certainly if you got enough size, like bulk, you
Yeah,
can play center in the Big
and he
Ten
does,
as
and he
6'9",
does
right?
exactly, and he
I mean,
does.
Michigan State's had a number of centers like 6'9", I think, and they held their own.
Xavier Tillman, one of the best Izzo's had, was 6'8".
Yeah,
So
he was pretty good. He had a decent
yeah,
career. So, uh, just as a quick reminder for our sponsors that Nudge Printing it does is our longest sponsor and does fantastic work as well. I got a big giant pile of stuff a couple weeks ago. What I got? I got like a couple t-shirts, a couple quarter zips. My son wanted a Michigan State golfing quarter zip, which is really cool. Kelly green. It's got a little Sparty golfer. My daughter got a jacket, which she needs for the fall when she's back on campus. I got some sweatshirts that are for whiteouts because I never had anything that was actually appropriate for whiteouts. I only had green stuff. So anyway, so I got a bunch of stuff, and it is truly the most like the apparel that they print on is super comfortable, and it's the best. And so Nudge Printing, you can't go wrong. If you need a pile of stuff getting ready for the football season or whatever it is, just tooling around the house or around the yard or whatever. Make sure you head on over to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. Huge selection, not only Michigan State stuff, but other stuff too. If you've got family members who went to other schools and they want to represent, unless they went to University of Michigan, in which case they're just out of luck. They got to go somewhere else to get some stuff. Gabe has drawn the line at Michigan. Although it is of Indiana, he doesn't have Purdue. So my son will have to wait another year for Purdue to get online. But I think they have Minnesota now and Iowa. So he's slowly adding Big Ten teams. So if you want stuff, and my wife almost got an Iowa thing, but we didn't quite. So head over to Nudge Printing. Get 20% off as a listener to the show. Just type in Final Fours, one word at checkout. And then that brings us to the next offer is Julie Avent. I think it's how you pronounce his name, and he's a wing.
yeah. Again, I'm not clear yet where that's going to slot in. He's a New Jersey kid who I believe is going to be playing in Florida this winter. But
Really
he,
changed how the Michigan State's recruitment pattern. I mean, it's
yeah,
remarkable how much it's how
it's all over.
not
Yep.
international, but how continental it is, or
Yep.
whatever outside the region.
And interesting player has had a good, I believe, I'm trying to remember. I apologize. It's been a bit since I looked at his profile. I believe he's on the EYBL circuit. And I know that he's had a good spring. He's had a good start. He's an interesting one in that they've actually been recruiting him for a while. They started reaching out back last winter during the season, but obviously had not extended an offer yet. So we'll see. Again, I don't have a story like with Costello where there's evidence that hey, Michigan State's after the offer watching the kid. They're going out and
Hmm.
seeing him. So that's a clear indicator as to the interest level. I don't have any of that kind of information yet, but we'll see what emerges. Interesting thing about him is he has NBA bloodlines. His dad, a guy named Anthony Avent, and played I think 6 years or so in the NBA. So that's something that's usually seen as a positive when you've got players that come from that background. They tend to have uh, a pretty well grounded understanding of what goes into being a player. And
Hmm.
at Michigan State, at least, it's proven to be, they haven't had a ton of them. There's some programs like I remember John Beeline's Michigan program for a while seemed to be specializing in that. They were getting guys, Tim Hardaway Jr. and some others.
Right.
Um, but the guys MSU has had, you think about Jaron Jackson, you think about Jase
Hmm.
Richardson. These are some of the better players that have ever been in Izzo's program. So they've had a pretty good experience with guys like that. So that's an element that I think is worth keeping in mind. But we'll see how serious that recruitment ends up being.
And then let's talk briefly about Jase Richardson. As everyone knows, he entered the NBA draft. He ended up going 25th to Orlando Magic in the first round. So, what do you think about sort of where his location, where he landed? I'll be first admit I hardly watch the NBA, like almost never. So
Well,
I'm not too familiar with the teams
it
and
could be
like where this
it could
is.
be worse. It could be worse. They're a team that I think is seen as having potential. They've got a lot of young players that are in key roles. Unfortunately, they've got a few guys from the University of Michigan who are in key roles, so he's going to have to adjust to that. But
Some
yeah,
fun bets in the locker room, yeah.
Paulo Banchero is their starter, or their star, I should say, ex
Hmm.
of Duke. You may remember him.
Yep.
Um, and he's a very good player. They have Franz Wagner has emerged as a very good player. They also have Mo Wagner. Their point guard is Jalen Suggs, who you may remember from Gonzaga,
Hmm.
from Minnesota. So there's some young talent there, and they're definitely seen as a team on the up. The other thing that I suppose is nice, is that the family, of course, is in Miami, so
Right.
pretty good proximity for that. His dad did play for Orlando for a bit. Wasn't the prime, when I think of Jason, I think of him primarily as a Warrior, and
Yeah.
he did time for Phoenix too. But he did play in Orlando, so that's good. So I think there's a lot of positives. Once we got past the combine where the measurement thing came up, and it became obvious, okay, he's not going to go lottery the way there were some projections earlier in the process. This was a very popular mocked landing spot for him. So it wasn't a surprise. And, I get the sense there's talk about him playing both on and off the ball, and maybe that's how it emerges. But I still think his future is primarily as a point guard because of the size. It just has to be. I just don't think you're likely to see him playing a lot or primarily as an off ball guy. So that's going to take some time because he hasn't had to, certainly he hasn't played at all at this level, but he hasn't had to do that in a while. And
Right.
so I don't know. It remains to be seen. Is this a situation where he's going to log a lot of G League time, or are they going to end up playing him primarily with the NBA team and he kind of learns on the fly there. It remains to be seen. But in general, in terms of the where the team sits, the proximity to home, all of those things, it would all seem to be very good. He didn't go to a franchise that's in tatters,
Right.
which is always, that would be the better outcome would be to land someplace where at least it looks like you got a chance to win.
Right. Yeah. It's always the balancing act, right? Winning and being able to develop and actually play versus just
Right.
sitting on the bench the whole time. And so,
Yeah, but I will say it doesn't look to me like it's obvious that he's not going to have a role right away. I mean,
yeah.
I've
Well,
been of the mind for a while that a G League stint was going to be a high possibility just because of the transition to primarily playing another position. But it does look to me like there's a chance there's a role for him, and maybe he won't have to play a ton of G League.
I think it's tough for us to predict too. I mean, obviously injuries are one thing that can happen and you get
Yeah,
called up or play. But also I think, I kind of look back to Max Christie. I did not anticipate him playing much and I thought he'd be,
right,
in the G League and
right.
he just kind of barely played in the G League if I recall. And he pretty much played
Yep.
he didn't play a ton his rookie year, but he played some and then he sort of just kind of, worked his way and just didn't have much in the G League. So he pretty much just
Right.
played. Now that's a different position, but you know,
Yeah,
you,
no, for sure.
you
You
just never
can't
know.
know. You can't. And I would say this, I'll reiterate some of the things I've said the last few months. Um, if you're betting on somebody maximizing their chances, whatever those might be, whatever the ceiling is for him, I would say there's a pretty good chance that guy is gonna give you everything he's got. Is that
Yeah.
enough to sustain a long NBA career or be a really big contributor or even some kind of star? Who knows? But I don't think he's going to leave anything on the table. I
Yeah.
think you're
I
going to
think you're
get
right.
the best of what he can potentially be, and then if that's the case, you got to live with that. I mean, that's as much as you can ask.
He's totally a kind of guy in about 15 years. I could see just being a color commentator and watch and basketball games like a Robbie Hummel. He is,
Oh, if that's what he wants to do, I mean,
right. I mean,
I
yeah, he
think
could
the
do whatever he
sky's the
wants. I
limit.
think, like, yeah,
He's a sharp enough guy that I mean, it's absurdly early to talk about that. But if you told me, 25 years from now he's involved in a front office somewhere, that wouldn't shock me.
no, no,
Or if
pretty
he's
much
doing something
anything.
outside of basketball, yeah, that's the thing that was really impressive about him is
Yeah.
that, and when we talked to him, it was so obvious you were dealing. I mean, MSU more than most programs has had a lot of sharp guys. That's something academics is something that have always been. And I'm not pretending that everybody is a Rhodes Scholar who's come through the program, but and listeners know what I'm talking about. Like that's not, they're not plain school. They actually emphasize that, and they have attracted a lot of sharp guys. I mean, even guys who have gone in the NBA. Somebody like Jaren Jackson, very bright guy. It's
Right.
obvious.
Yeah.
You know, Max Christie. I mean, there's a lot of them. Draymond Green, um, and he's another one. So I keep coming back to it, man. When I listen to him and I watched him play and all that, I just kept, and I'm not saying he's exactly the same player that he's going to have the same career, but I just Joe Dumars is the guy that just seemed he reminds me of so much.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a guy that went on to have that kind of post playing career. So
He did. Yeah. He
we'll
did
see.
okay.
We'll
Yeah.
see.
Well, let's talk briefly about Mateen Cleaves Jr. I know that he's not class of 2026, but he's always on the minds of Michigan State fans. They've started playing obviously summer basketball, and there was, I guess, when his, I'm trying to think back when we first talked about him, probably like a year ago. There was a lot of, well, he's a freshman. He's playing on a high school team. We'll see how the team did. They had a really very good season. He was actually a decent contributor on that team as well. It'll be more his
Yeah.
team going forward now because I think a number of the players graduated, and he's had a good summer. So I think let's just talk about him briefly. I do feel a little bit bad for him in the sense that with the name Michigan State fans, automatically assume he's coming to Michigan State, uh, but also that they pay so much attention to him. He's almost the worry is, of course, you elevate him to beyond what he is, and projecting what his dad's success on
Well,
him. So anyway, I'll let you go
I
on from there.
I think yeah, I'm not worried about that. I mean, yes, those are all valid concerns. I'm not saying they're not, but um, I think that early suggestions are that everybody involved is well equipped to handle all that. There's
Hmm.
also an element that's probably going to make it at least a little bit easier. He ain't going to play at Orchard Lake St. Mary. This hasn't been announced formally, publicly, but the word is that Mateen Sr. is going to be part of the Phoenix Suns organization,
Oh, okay.
and that Mateen Jr. will be playing at a school somewhere in Phoenix. So the fact that he's not in Michigan, I think, will dial that back a little bit. And again, this has not been announced publicly, but it's not being hidden. He is. I mentioned that there are these summertime. There's especially in June, there tend to be high school oriented events that go on, and he did not play for Orchard Lake St. Mary in that. So that was a pretty good tell. And then again, the rumor mill is that look, it stands to reason because Phoenix is becoming MSU West. Brian Gregory, the
Right.
longtime assistant, couple stints at Michigan State, is going to be is the general manager now. Obviously, everybody knows Matt Ishby owns the team. It's not a surprise that this would happen. So I think that's what's likely. And it's unfortunate for a lot of MSU fans because you look forward to having 3 years to watch him progress locally and be able to go out and physically see the games, and now that seems unlikely. So yeah, that's the scenario on that front. He also played. He was one of a handful of players from the family AAU team to play in the NBA PA's top 100 camp recently. It was like a couple of weeks ago, and he was outstanding. He
Hmm.
um, his team won. They have actual teams that play games and these things. They won the championship, and he had the top assist to turnover ratio of anybody in the camp. And these are again, this is you're talking about guys in the 27 and 28 class. He's in 28, so it's largely the best of the best, and
Hmm.
that's what he was able to do. He led his team to that's what I'm saying. I don't think these are going to be problems. The expectation. I think he's a different. To reiterate things we've talked about before, he's a different player than his father. He's already bigger. I think he's about 6'3" right now. So who knows? Might end up 6'4", 6'5", but he's already bigger. He's well put together. He's got his body's got to be reshaped and all that stuff, but he's going to be fine from that perspective. The big difference is he's not as explosive an athlete as his father was
Right.
pre-rollover. That's not to say he's not athletic, but he's not that. Mateen
Yeah.
pre-rollover was something else. But he's a shooter. He's a legitimate. You watch him, he makes them, and the shot looks good. That was never a strength of his father's.
No, I know.
So
People forget that.
so that's a big difference. They're not, even though they play the same position, they're not the same player. But what they share in common, the most important traits, it looks like to me, when the little bit I've been able to watch him, is high basketball IQ, really understands the game, plays hard, and makes the right decisions. And seems to be kind of innate with him, or it's been coached into him to focus on making others around him better. That's the thing you hear said a lot about him.
Hmm.
And again, that performance at the top 100 camp seems to suggest that. So, yeah, quickly becoming a very legitimate prospect, and I think he's going to be. You're not going to see rankings for that class until possibly the fall. You'll start seeing them because rising sophomores. but I'm going to be shocked if he's not. I'm not going to say top five, top 10, any of that. That's who knows. But he's going to be just what he's done already this spring and summer. It's just too obvious. Like he's going to be somewhere in the top 100. I just can't fathom that he wouldn't be, and
Sure.
maybe much higher than that. And yeah, if he goes anywhere other than Michigan State, he'd be absolutely floored. I mean,
Right.
that's just I just can't see it.
I know. I have a hard time imagining too. Boy, that would be soul crushing for Michigan if that didn't
Yeah,
happen. But we,
well, yeah, there's never look that you can't even compare that to any other recruitment in terms of what the down effect would be on people's psyches if it went that way. But I just, not knowing anything else, but come on.
all right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. That's a good place to end. We'll be coming back to you weekly until the Big Ten previews begin in August. So, a couple near the end of halfway through the month of August, we'll start hitting those, usually 2 a week until we get through all 17, 18 teams, the Big Ten. So until next time, the Final Four is not on the schedule. Go green.